In the biting winter of 1840, deep within the pine-shadowed region of Hollow Creek, Kentucky, something quietly unfolded that would haunt the underbelly of American history for generations. On the surface, Hollow Creek was the kind of place forgotten. By time, a township stitched together with smoke from coal fires, wooden beams darkened by humidity, and the soft hum of wagons rolling across frozen earth. But beneath its stillness, a force had begun to stir, not born of nature, but of something stranger, colder. Something calculated. At the heart of this quiet place stood a child. His name was Noah Griggs, 11 years old, with an expression that betrayed no emotion and eyes that seemed to study the world with surgical detachment. He was not mischievous like other boys, nor dreamy, nor afraid of thunder or blood. He was something else entirely, a machine made flesh. No one could say when exactly it began, but those who lived long enough to look back would whisper that 1840 was the year the storms grew. Intelligent. Noah lived in a modest home on the edge of Hollow Creek, tucked between the coal mills and the limestone ridge that marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. His father, Elias Griggs, had made a fortune the war had tried to take from him. A weapons merchant by trade, Elias dealt with both Unionists and secessionists alike, long before either side officially declared what they were. He knew the cost of war, not in ideology, but in inventory. And that's what he taught his son: how to count crates of bullets, how to calculate shipment delays based on rainfall, and most importantly, how to see people not as neighbors or enemies, but as variables. Noah absorbed everything. By 6, he could recite military logistics manuals. By 8, he spoke English, German, and Choctaw fluently. By 10, he had already corrected a shipment manifest error that would have bankrupted the Griggs operation. But numbers were just the beginning. It was what he saw behind the numbers, the pattern of human behavior, that made him dangerous. Hollow Creek was not immune to the rising tension that was beginning to spread across the states like an invisible fever. Everyone suspected everyone else. Northerners passed through town with suspicious eyes, and Southern sympathizers gathered in barns at night to talk of sovereignty and strategy. But Noah didn't care for flags or sides. He cared only for inputs and outcomes. And where most men saw chaos and war, he saw the architecture of opportunity. That winter, a new kind of unrest crept into the region. Quiet, calculated raids began hitting small settlements along the county's edge. Nothing official, no proclamations, no enemy flags. Just torched barns, missing families, and whispers of some unseen hand pulling strings. Locals thought it might be bands of former militia or desperate vagrants hardened by the Depression. But they were wrong. The pattern was too clean, too logical. It wasn't long before whispers turned toward the Griggs estate, not as suspects, but as victims of information theft. A courier's bag went missing in late January, containing supply records and shipping schedules from Griggs' foundry. 3 days later, a Choctaw scout showed up with a bullet lodged in his shoulder, claiming someone was selling artillery maps to the Creole rebels down in Mississippi. Elias Griggs was furious, but Noah wasn't. He was intrigued. On the night of February 3rd, while his father paced the study, barking orders and drawing up new security protocols, Noah sat silently at the corner desk, quill in hand, eyes scanning an open ledger. He wasn't reading shipments or costs. He was studying a timeline, a web of movement. He drew it like a map, not of roads or towns, but of influence. He connected every attack, every sale, every intercepted letter. When he was done, he didn't look proud. He looked certain. Noah had never attended a schoolhouse, but he knew the mechanics of strategy like a veteran officer. In truth, he saw the world not in moments, but in systems, each event a part of a greater rhythm, each person a node in a living equation. And he was beginning to test just how far that rhythm could be pushed. It began with the Whitmore family, settlers who lived just north of the trade route between Lexington and Danville. They had recently declined the munitions order from Elias Griggs in favor of cheaper alternatives sourced through unofficial routes. Noah saw this as more than lost business. He saw it as inefficiency. And inefficiency, to Noah, demanded correction. Boy sent a letter, disguised as correspondence from a Union quartermaster, warning the Whitmores that they were being watched, that Confederate scouts had flagged their farm as a possible supply outpost. There was no threat in the letter, just implications, just enough ambiguity to set fear crawling into their minds. The result was swift and predictable. The Whitmores abandoned the route altogether, moving their inventory east, which coincidentally left their southern perimeter vulnerable. Days later, a raiding party swept through, burned their storage barn to ash, and left the area untouched otherwise. It was a clean operation. Minimal damage, maximum message. And Noah, with a note of satisfaction, recorded every detail in his personal journal, including the spike in weapons orders that came in from surrounding farms within 48 hours. To most, this might look like coincidence. To Elias Griggs, it was a windfall. But to Noah, it was an experiment, a test, and the results were better than he'd imagined. From there, he grew bolder. He started manipulating supply routes, planting false reports, adjusting timestamps on delivery ledgers. He used his father's wide network of contacts like chess pieces. A rumor started in Pikeville would make its way down to Nashville, evolve, mutate, and circle back into Griggs' hands as verified intelligence. All under the radar. All invisible. Noah's favorite trick, however, was the mirrored message. He would send two versions of the same report, one to a Union loyalist, the other to a Confederate agent, each one slightly altered. The Union letter might claim a supply stash was vulnerable to Southern raids, while the Confederate version warned of an ambush near the same site. The result? Both sides would converge, suspicious and armed, and chaos would bloom exactly where. Noah wanted it. The genius wasn't in the lie. It was in the timing. Noah never needed to shout. He never needed to lift a weapon. His battlefield was paper and ink, his soldiers were words, and his victories came in the form of demand. Every clash he orchestrated generated fear. And fear was the greatest salesman his father never hired. By March, Hollow Creek had unknowingly become a living simulation of Noah's mind, a place where tension didn't rise randomly, but precisely. People spoke of rising violence, of the smell of war coming downwind from the Tennessee border. But no one saw the boy behind the ledger. No one suspected the child who spoke only when necessary, who asked questions not out of curiosity, but to test a hypothesis. Something strange had taken root in 1840. Not a spirit, not a curse, but something colder. A child who saw in humanity's chaos a formula he could calculate, predict, and control. And that child had only just begun. By early April, the tension hanging over Hollow Creek was no longer abstract. It moved through the town like a fog, too thick to name, too quiet to escape. Farmers double-checked their doors at night. Gunpowder was bought in bulk. Every whisper carried weight. The strange part was, no single enemy had emerged. There were no flags, no ultimatums, no demands. Just a steady unraveling of trust, and behind it all, a boy whose hands had never touched a blade. Noah Griggs had found something better than weapons. He had discovered leverage. And as his web of influence expanded, so did the sophistication of his tactics. The Whitfield incident began not with violence, but with information, as most of Noah's operations did. The Whitfields were an established family out of Carter County, known for their loyalty to the Confederacy. Patriarch Marshall Whitfield had once commanded a volunteer, militia, and now managed one of the largest ammunition stockpiles in the county. His family's political leanings were no secret, and that made them useful. Noah first heard about the Whitfields through intercepted correspondence. A supply ledger passed through his father's hands containing details about recent arms, purchases, militia coordination, and troop movement schedules. Most merchants would have sold this to the highest bidder, but Noah wasn't after a quick profit. He saw in the Whitfields a greater opportunity. His plan was simple, yet brutally efficient: cause a fracture that would ripple outward, undermining trust, destabilizing alliances, and triggering a fresh wave of demand. The first seed was a letter. Noah drafted it by hand, mimicking the style and penmanship of a Confederate courier. The message warned that the Union had placed spies inside Hollow Creek, using trade networks to identify Confederate collaborators. The letter included names, some real, some invented, but the critical part was the implication. The Whitfields had been compromised. The letter never reached the Whitfields. It was intercepted, deliberately, by a Union scout who had previously dealt with Elias Griggs. The scout, curious and cautious, shared it with his commanding officer. Within days, Union troops began conducting low-profile reconnaissance. Near Carter County, that movement was expected. It was step 1. Step 2 involved a different deception. Noah sent a second message, this one to Marshal Whitfield himself. It was styled as a Confederate intelligence update, warning that certain arms dealers had been bribed by the Union to leak supply routes. The letter implied that Elias Griggs was among them. That was all it took. On April 17th, Marshal Whitfield confronted Elias Griggs in front of 2 witnesses at the town's mill house. The argument, though brief, spread quickly through the county. A respected former commander accusing a known arms merchant of treason, even without proof, was enough to set fires in the minds of both sides. Overnight, neutral merchants became suspect, and Griggs' northern clientele grew paranoid. Noah watched it all unfold with silent fascination. His goal had never been to protect his father's reputation. Quite the opposite. A dent in the family's public trust allowed him to draw out deeper reactions. And that's exactly what came next. 2 nights later, unknown raiders struck the Whitfield farm. They came just before midnight, masked and coordinated. The barn was torched first, followed by the storehouse. Livestock scattered into the night as gunshots rang out, but the raiders didn't stay long. They left behind no bodies, no stolen goods, only confusion and ashes. No one claimed responsibility. No flag was raised. But the message was received. Marshal Whitfield believed the Griggs family had orchestrated the hit. He sent word to his remaining contacts in Tennessee, demanding a counter-response. Within a week, Union troops increased their patrols through the region, citing concerns about destabilization. Meanwhile, Confederate sympathizers started stockpiling arms. Again, buying from anyone but the Griggs family. Except that was part of Noah's design, while his father lamented the sudden loss of trust in Hollow Creek. Noah had already begun shifting the business outward. He used lesser-known intermediaries, mule traders, traveling blacksmiths, and postal riders to continue arms distribution under different names. Now, every transaction came with a double benefit: money and anonymity. The Whitfield collapse had accomplished 3 objectives. It discredited the family in Union circles. It undermined faith in the Griggs name among Confederate buyers. And it reignited fear across both borders. Noah recorded it all in his private ledger, not with numbers alone, but with written analysis. He mapped cause and effect. For every torch lit, he documented who benefited. For every accusation spread, he marked the shift in sentiment. It wasn't chaos to him. It was orchestration. He called it the differential. It was a concept he developed after the Whitfield raid. The idea that fear always traveled faster than information, and the delay between the two could be harvested. FOR gain. When people act before they understand, they create ripple effects that smart minds can monetize. Noah didn't just believe this. He tested it. He created minor conflicts throughout nearby towns using the same strategy. A misdelivered message here, a mistranslated statement there. By the end of April, 3 unrelated families had been labeled as informants. 2 trading posts had closed due to suspected sabotage. And arms requests tripled. Each time someone tried to trace the cause of these incidents, they found nothing. Because there was nothing, no single lie, no singular act. Just suggestions, rumors whispered at the right moment. Misunderstandings with just enough truth to avoid suspicion. Noah didn't destroy trust with a hammer. He chipped at it. Until the structure collapsed on its own. In the town square, elders began whispering that someone was playing both sides, a ghost among them, too clever to catch. No one thought to suspect the boy who sat quietly by the stove each day, reading old military campaign reports and drawing strange diagrams in a leather-bound journal. What he was doing had no name. Not then. Intelligence officers wouldn't develop the language for it until decades later. But Noah Griggs had already invented it in silence. Information warfare. By the start of May, Hollow Creek was divided not by flags or armies, but by suspicion. Families stopped sharing tools. Neighbors stopped walking to church together. People started sleeping with their rifles close. And every new rumor felt like a match dropped near dry grass. This was the environment Noah preferred, not open war, but frayed peace. Because it was in uncertainty that people became most desperate. And desperate people bought anything that made them feel safe, especially weapons. Back at the Griggs home, Elias had begun to notice the pattern, not in full, but enough to suspect that someone was pulling strings. He blamed the union, blamed former clients, blamed rival dealers. But it never crossed his mind that the storm was forming in his own study, at the desk where his son now sat most evenings. Noah never claimed credit. He didn't need to. His satisfaction came from watching a calculation bear fruit. Each person, each town, each side, all reacting exactly as predicted, as designed. In the stillness of that Kentucky spring, while other children played near creeks and gathered stones, Noah Griggs began refining his equations. He no longer wondered if he could shape the world. He now asked himself how much of it he could reshape before anyone realized who had done it. By mid-May, the rhythm of Hollow Creek had transformed completely. What was once a sleepy frontier township now felt like a stage lit for something far larger. You could feel it in the silence between conversations, in the way people eyed each other over fence lines, and in how quickly strangers were judged as threats. But all of it was noise to Noah Griggs, background static to the real symphony playing beneath the surface. He was composing not with music, but with patterns, probabilities, and pain. He had discovered a new tool, not a rifle, not a ledger, but something far more versatile. The mail route, what began as innocent observations, had now become a full-fledged manipulation system. Noah understood the postal schedules better than the riders themselves. He knew who collected what, when they passed through which ridge, and which envelopes would remain unopened for days if timed right. But it wasn't the mail itself that mattered. It was what the mail represented: connection, trust, timelines, and trust, once distorted, could become a weapon. Noah's design required variables: a trigger, a target, and a beneficiary. And his next target was the Brody settlement, a cluster of families 20 miles west of Hollow Creek, known for trading tobacco and supplying both Union sympathizers and Southern loyalists, depending on the buyer. It was a balancing act they performed for years. Noah saw it as a structure just waiting for the right crack. He started by writing 2 letters. The first, forged in the hand of a Union intelligence officer, claimed that Brody farmers had begun passing information to Southern militias. It named no one, gave no evidence, but used military phrasing and stamps Noah had studied obsessively. The second letter, designed as a Confederate communique, warned of spies embedded within. Brody, who had been secretly reporting weapon shipments to Union scouts. Both letters were planted, not mailed, left deliberately where they'd be found. By the right eyes. A bartender who owed Elias Griggs a favor slipped one to a traveler from Lexington. A traveling preacher delivered the other under the guise of righteous concern. Within days, the Brody settlement was no longer neutral. It was infected. Suspicion rippled faster than wagons could roll. On May 22nd, a Union supply scout was turned. Away at gunpoint from a Brody barn where he'd once been welcomed with open arms. The same night, a Southern contractor was shot dead during what should have been a routine trading stop. No one claimed responsibility. No one needed to. The effect was more powerful than the act. Noah, back in Hollow Creek, watched reports trickle in through his father's contacts. Newspaper whispers, trader rumors, delayed returns. He studied them all, measuring the tempo of reaction against the timing of his disinformation. And the result fascinated him. It worked faster than expected. He called this mechanism the deception engine, a system that, once triggered, continued to operate on its own. Human fear, it turned out, required very little maintenance. Once planted, a falsehood needed only time and isolation to thrive. What Noah hadn't expected, however, was how much local power this would generate for the Griggs family, with both sides retreating from Brody and cutting ties with each other. The surrounding settlements sought new partners, ones they could trust, or at least ones with predictable greed. That was the role Elias Griggs had always played best. Weapon orders surged, not in bulk, but in rapid small-scale transactions, the kind that didn't attract federal eyes. And with each request, Noah inserted just a hint of extra detail. Something harmless on the surface, a delivery window, a route, a suggested escort, all designed to reroute resources through areas Noah was already manipulating. It wasn't about profit anymore. It was about control. Noah realized that if he could guide when and where weapons moved, he could steer the flow of conflict itself, not with bullets, but with suggestion. He began testing this theory with precision. He learned of a shipment set to travel north through Benson Pass, a narrow strip of road that traders avoided after heavy rains. Noah modified the weather report, not with a storm, but with absence. He created a forged message indicating the pass was unusually dry and faster than normal. The convoy shifted routes. 3 days later, a skirmish broke out on Benson Pass. An ambush by bandits armed with freshly acquired Griggs weapons. Bandits Noah had never met. Bandits who were just another variable in his design. The echo of this event stretched for weeks. The Union blamed Confederate scouts. Confederates blamed Northern sympathizers. Traders rerouted around the pass, which created choke points on alternative roads. Those choke points created new fears. Fears led to more demand. And so the deception engine roared on, fed by its own exhaust. Back home, Elias had begun to suspect something strange. Not criminal, just uncanny. His son, once a quiet boy with an obsession for books, now seemed to anticipate supply problems before they arose. He offered route changes that proved prophetic, predicted shortages, forecasted aggression from towns where no conflict had yet sparked. Elias credited it to intuition, perhaps genius. What he didn't know was that his son had stopped predicting reality and started designing it. By the time May gave way to June, Noah's control stretched across 5 counties. Not through fear or violence, but through invisible influence. No one suspected the quiet child sitting on the porch with a notebook, sketching supply routes while other children chased chickens or fished in the creek. They saw a boy, not a tactician, but Noah had begun to feel something new, not satisfaction, but possibility. A realization that the boundary of what he could control wasn't limited to towns or traders. It might stretch much farther. One night, he drew a spiral in his journal. At the center, a dot marked signal. Around it, rings labeled reaction, movement, and finally repercussion. To the untrained eye, it might look like doodles. But to Noah, it was a war map, not of soldiers, but of psychology. He believed that the more time people spent preparing for imaginary enemies, the more real those enemies became. And if he could control imagination, he could control outcomes. Tested this again with a different method, gossip. He sent a coded message through a tavern in Salem Ridge, claiming that Hollow Creek had been targeted for invasion by an unknown force. No names, no times. Just the idea. That's all it took. Within 72 hours, 4 families fled town. 2 militia companies posted temporary scouts along the nearby ridges. Traders rerouted. And 5 separate orders for Griggs rifles arrived by courier. Noah hadn't just anticipated the future, he had manufactured it. Even Elias began to lean in, watching his son with a strange blend of awe and caution. The boy who once shadowed his father's footsteps now charted paths of his own, and those paths twisted through the veins of counties, shaping commerce and conflict alike. The child was no longer simply observant. He was the algorithm. By the final week of June, a traveling merchant, a man named Wendell Pryor, arrived at the Griggs estate. Wendell was known for mapping trade dynamics across the state, collecting patterns like most men collect coins. He met with Elias over 2 long nights, speaking in low tones about something unusual. Wendell claimed there were signs of orchestration. In the recent violence, too many coincidences, too many delays. He mentioned the Brody incident, Benson Pass, the disappearing couriers. Wendell believed someone was shaping the chaos, someone invisible. Noah listened from behind the study door, pencil in hand. He smiled. The world was catching glimpses of the design. But they would never see the architect. Not yet. By early July, the hills of Kentucky simmered under a thick curtain of humidity and dread. Farmers blamed the heat for their restlessness, but it wasn't the temperature that kept them awake at night. It was uncertainty. Raids that had no signatures. Scouts disappearing without a trace. 2 settlements abandoning their homes in a single week. It all smelled of war, though no one could point to a battlefield. No declaration had been made. No armies had marched. But something was happening. Something too complex for coincidence. At the center of it sat a boy whose hands remained clean. Noah Griggs had begun to experiment with a higher form of manipulation, the simulation of fear without the necessity of violence. He called it the phantom signal. The theory was simple. If people could be made to react to events that hadn't happened, those reactions would eventually shape reality itself. A rumor, planted carefully, would ripple outward until its effects became tangible, no matter its origin. He tested this in Crossfield, a village east of Hollow Creek, nestled in a shallow valley where 2 rivers met. The town had no strategic value, no military presence, and no political leanings strong enough to attract attention. That was exactly why Noah chose it. The goal wasn't to strike a target. It was to watch what people would do when they only thought they were under threat. He began with an anonymous note left at the church steps. Written in shaky, panicked handwriting, the message warned of a planned raid by desperate factions who intended to punish Crossfield for trading with Union merchants. The note included no names, only times and vague locations. It referenced a past skirmish that never occurred, but sounded just plausible enough. It also cited a nearby ridge, Hollow Bluff, as the likely staging area for the attack. Next morning, the message was read aloud by the preacher during the town's morning gathering. He wasn't trying to cause panic, but panic isn't something you need to try to create, especially not in times like these. Within 24 hours, local militia were summoned from farms. By the second day, the general store was sold out of lead shot and black powder. On the third, families began boarding up their homes. A watchtower was erected by the riverbank, a place no one had thought to guard before. On the fourth day, a group of armed men hiked to Hollow Bluff and fired warning shots into the trees. No one was there. Of course, Noah had never set foot in Crossfield. He didn't need to. He studied the outcome from a distance, listening to traders and couriers as they passed through Hollow Creek. One rider mentioned a ghost raid. Another claimed someone saw smoke in the woods. All of it nonsense, born from a message that had never been signed, never verified, never true. And yet, the aftermath was measurable. The nearby towns took note of Crossfield's sudden alarm and began to question their own safety. This created secondary panic. Orders for rifles came in, from parishes that had previously sworn neutrality. By the week's end, Elias Griggs processed a shipment so large he had to delay 3 deliveries just to fill it. Noah documented every consequence in his journal. He wasn't just testing theories anymore. He was modeling reality. What fascinated him most was how little resistance people gave to fear. They invited it, welcomed it, treated it like prophecy. Once they believed an event was coming, they behaved as if it had already happened. And those behaviors rippled outward, influencing others who hadn't even seen the original trigger. A single lie could carry more weight than 1,000 facts, so long as it arrived first. This realization gave birth to Noah's next invention, the triad method. He would release 3 variations of a falsehood across different communities. One would be vague, one would be specific, and one would be neutral. He would then track which version generated the strongest reaction. Over time, he refined this technique into something close to science, understanding how tone, timing, and target audience could shape the velocity of panic. He tested the triad on Boone Hollow, a narrow settlement straddling the line between Union-controlled roads and independent farming plots. It was a community known for its pragmatism, and thus a perfect petri dish. Version A was planted in a saloon, a vague story about Confederate deserters planning to take over the general store. Version B was slipped to the postmaster, a letter naming 2 local families as Union informants. Version C was left at the church steps again, suggesting a general growing tension and advising the community to pray for peace. Version B sparked the match. By the following Sunday, the 2 named families had been socially exiled, accused of treason, and forced to flee to a nearby county. No raid ever came. No deserters appeared. But the damage was done. And Noah had learned something new. Specificity wasn't just more effective. It created permanence. When people believed something might happen, they prepared. When they believed it had happened, even if false, they acted and never went back. The data was intoxicating. Back at the Griggs estate, Elias noticed his son's growing obsession with detail. Noah now spent hours cross-referencing dates, places, even dialect variations in letters. He claimed it helped him understand the world. Elias chalked it up to genius, albeit a troubling kind. He had no idea that every piece of correspondence passing through the estate was being copied by his son, cataloged, and studied for weaknesses. Noah wasn't reading letters anymore. He was reading behavior. And he had begun sketching larger designs. What if, he wondered, he could simulate a series of attacks across multiple counties, none of which ever actually occurred, and yet all of which provoked real evacuations? Real militia responses and real economic shifts? Could he force a town into bankruptcy just by making them defend against a ghost? Could he redirect a state's political momentum with carefully planted fear? He believed he could. He started small, using an abandoned hill fort once used by scouts during the Indian removal campaigns. Noah spread word that rebels were reorganizing in secret. The fort had long been empty, but within a week of the rumor spreading, Union officials sent 3 riders to investigate. Their arrival spooked nearby farmers, who mistook them for federal agents surveying land for conscription. This triggered petitions, protests, and eventually violence in a town that had never been touched by war. It was all fake, all manufactured, but the blood that followed was real. Noah wrote it down. Simulation of fear produces authentic conflict. Authentic conflict yields authentic profit. That line, buried in a page between drawings of regional trade routes, would become the thesis of his entire worldview. By late July, Noah's operations had grown so complex that they no longer required his constant attention. Like an engine that now ran on its own momentum, the world began responding to shadows of his own making. He didn't have to forge letters anymore. Others were doing it now. Frightened townsmen sending pleas to generals, preachers warning of conspiracies, merchants asking for armed escorts, all responding to falsehoods that Noah had long since abandoned. He was no longer planting fear. He was harvesting it. In the final days of the month, a single event would seal this new evolution of his strategy. A Confederate patrol, acting on intelligence they believed to be reliable, attempted to intercept a Union weapons caravan. The attack failed. The caravan had never existed. 3 soldiers died. 2 families were displaced. And Hollow Creek received another request for arms. Noah Griggs sat on the porch that evening, pencil tapping the arm of his chair. In the distance, smoke curled from the hills. He hadn't lifted a hand, and yet the world bent around his intentions. He began to understand something that frightened even him. He no longer needed to lie to people. They would lie to each other for him, so long as he gave them a reason to believe. August arrived like a fever, not in temperature, but in temperament. All across central Kentucky, towns once quiet and predictable now pulsed with unrest. Men who once nodded politely at one another now clutched their rifles a little tighter. Families packed wagons at dusk. Postmasters hesitated to send letters, without first whispering suspicions about who might be watching. Fear was no longer just felt. It was shared. Noah Griggs watched this transformation unfold from his corner of the world. A small room with dusty windows and a notebook stacked high with symbols, dates, and consequences. He hadn't just mapped the changing landscape of regional conflict. He had drawn its blueprint. Now he was going to test just how far it could bend before it broke. The next experiment would take place in Cold Hollow, a logging village cradled by dense forest just west of the Salt River. The town was small, mostly self-sustained, and sat between 2 merchant routes that fed directly into Tennessee. It was a strategic intersection without realizing it, and that made it vulnerable. Noah's objective was simple: prove that a single false narrative could dismantle a functioning town, not through destruction, but through the gradual erosion of trust. He began with a courier, a man named Hollis. Dent, who passed through Hollow Creek every 2 weeks on his way to Cold Hollow. Hollis liked whiskey and casual conversation, 2 traits Noah found useful. One evening, Noah fed him a story, soft, subtle, and just believable enough. He claimed Union scouts had intercepted Southern supply manifests detailing Cold Hollow as a suspected smuggling post. Hollis laughed, shook his head, and dismissed it. But when he rode out the next morning, he took the story with him, not because he believed it, but because it was interesting. That was all Noah needed. by the time Hollis arrived in Cold Hollow. The story had taken shape. At the tavern, he mentioned it offhandedly, something he'd heard in Hollow Creek. He didn't remember the details, but the seed had been planted. And within 3 days, local whispers began. First came paranoia. Merchants worried their shipments were being watched. Then suspicion. The mayor's brother had recently been to Lexington. Was he informing? Then came action. A town meeting was called. Supplies were re-inventoried. Hunting rifles were counted. Checkpoints were discussed. No attack had occurred. No soldiers had shown their faces. But Cold Hollow was unraveling all the same. Noah, back at his desk, recorded each response as relayed by second-hand sources. A traveling tinsmith mentioned increased patrols. A Griggs client from a neighboring township reported a spike in Cold Hollow's orders for gun oil and black powder. Noah marked the dates. He noted how quickly one whisper became policy, but this time he layered the deception. While Cold Hollow panicked about possible Union surveillance, Noah planted a second narrative in a nearby Confederate outpost. He used a forged document, mimicking the distinctive handwriting of a Tennessee quartermaster, a skill he'd perfected using discarded manifests. The document claimed Cold Hollow was harboring Union defectors who had fled south after ambushing a Confederate patrol. It named no one, but referenced a barn on the town's western edge. It was an invisible push, just enough to tilt the already fragile balance. 3 days later, a group of Southern riders appeared on Cold Hollow's outskirts. They didn't attack. They watched, asked questions, took notes. That alone was enough. The townsfolk panicked. Meetings turned into accusations. A local blacksmith was beaten for refusing to name who he'd sold his last 4 rifles to. The mayor declared the town under threat, though he couldn't say from whom. Some families left. Others dug trenches along their property lines. It wasn't war. It was the illusion of war. Noah labeled this outcome in his journal. Collapse without contact. A new principle. One that didn't require loss of life to be effective. One that created economic and psychological fallout without firing a shot. But soon, the illusion spilled into something real. On the night of August 14th, 2 local men, spooked by weeks of tension, spotted shadows near the barn mentioned in the forged document. They assumed it was the scouts. They fired. The result, 1 wounded lumberman, 1 dead teenager who'd been sneaking off to meet a girl. The town woke up to blood. Now it was real. And real fear is louder than the imagined kind. Within hours, Cold Hollow turned in on itself. Men patrolled, with rifles across their shoulders. Children were pulled from schools. The church became a makeshift fort. And the mayor, desperate to regain control, sent a request for arms, not to the government, but to Elias Griggs. The Griggs estate received the request with urgency. Elias, confused but opportunistic, fulfilled the order. Noah, without saying a word, added an additional note to the shipment, an unsigned warning that hostile scouts may target incoming supplies. The perfect bait. By the time the shipment arrived, a group of fearful townsmen were already waiting. They saw movement in the trees, and without confirming anything, they opened fire. The driver was killed. 2 crates of ammunition were destroyed in the crossfire, and the mayor, in panic, sent another message. This time, he asked for military support. News spread like thunder. A town had shot its own supplier. A mayor had called for soldiers. And no, one could agree on what they were even afraid of. Back in Hollow Creek, Noah folded the newspaper article about Cold Hollow's descent and placed it gently between the pages of his ledger. Then he drew a circle dot in the center. He wrote a single word: friction. He'd realized something critical. You didn't need a hammer to break people. Just sand in the gears. Friction was enough. Distrust slowed everything. Trade, dialogue, response time. And when things moved slower, fear moved faster. That became his new engine. He created small frictions everywhere, changing dates on ledgers, mismatching inventory lists, rewording public notices. All minor discrepancies, but they added up. Merchants started double-checking orders. Couriers missed shipments. Officials gave conflicting instructions. And each delay chipped away at confidence. It was slow erosion, like water beneath a stone bridge, but no one knew exactly where to widen the cracks. By the end of August, Cold Hollow was functionally paralyzed. Trade ceased. The logging mill shut down. Nearby towns closed their roads to Cold Hollow's wagons. In the absence of enemy fire, the town had devoured itself. The story made its way across Kentucky as a cautionary tale. But no one ever traced the origin. There was no trail, no signature. Only a quiet, unreadable boy in a quiet, unreadable town, scribbling in his journal, running simulations that had already become reality. To the world, Noah Griggs was just Elias's son. To those who might have watched more closely, and there were very few, he was beginning to look like something altogether unnatural, not evil, not possessed, just beyond, a presence that didn't rage or threaten, but one that rearranged the shape of fear itself. And if a boy could collapse, a town with nothing but a whisper, what might he do to a state? By early September, Kentucky's internal borders had become psychological more than geographical. Towns no longer shared updates, only warnings. Traders no longer passed through, they calculated risk. Riders carried more bullets than letters. And every empty wagon on the road was treated like a potential trap. The state was unraveling without a single formal war declaration. But one name never made it into the reports. Noah Griggs remained a shadow, tucked neatly behind the desk in his father's study, orchestrating chaos with such precision that even the chaos believed it had invented itself. He had, however, begun to crave something deeper, not more destruction, but more control over the pace of it. The Cold Hollow collapse had proven that mass reaction could be sparked without violence, but the timing had still been unpredictable. He wanted to tighten the screws, make the cycle faster and cleaner. He found his next test subject in the town of Briar Glen. It was a settlement carved into the southern hillside, known for its isolation and unusually strict civic order. Briar Glen had resisted panic longer than most towns. Its elders met weekly to calm disputes. Its storehouses were stocked. The town even operated a volunteer patrol, not as a militia, but as a community watch. It was the sort of place people whispered about when they longed for peace. Noah saw it as a fortress, not built of walls, but of trust. And he wanted to see what happened when a single crack was introduced at just the right point. He began with the most delicate of tools, a confession. On September 6th, a man named Elias Moore, a widowed schoolteacher with no history of political involvement, was found missing from his home. No struggle, no note, just gone. His classroom sat untouched, lessons still scribbled on the board. His coat hung by the door. A mug of unfinished coffee rested on the table. The town searched the woods for 3 days, but found no tracks, no body, no clues. And then the letter appeared. It was placed inside the church's donation box. No name, just a torn scrap of parchment bearing 8 words. He knew what they were doing. He talked. The town exploded into whispers. What had Elias Moore known? Who had he spoken to? Theories bloomed overnight. Some said he'd been meeting Union agents. Others whispered he'd learned about a planned Confederate raid. A few claimed he was a traitor, and that someone inside the town had silenced him. No one could agree on the truth, but everyone agreed on one thing. Trust had just taken a bullet. Noah hadn't killed Elias Moore. He hadn't even met the man. But he had chosen him for one reason. He was harmless, quiet, predictable, A disappearance like his carried weight because it had no natural explanation. It demanded a cause. And people terrified of a vacuum would invent their own. Briar. Glen changed overnight. The town council canceled open meetings. The patrol doubled in size and began conducting nightly checks on homes. Doors were reinforced. Church gatherings fell quiet. And perhaps most importantly, they stopped sharing supplies with neighboring towns. Briar Glen turned inward, tightening its perimeter, not just physically, but psychologically. Noah recorded the timeline of events in what he now called the spiral model. It followed a simple pattern: one disappearance, one planted message, 5 days of speculation, 10 days of containment behavior, and within 3 weeks, full communal lockdown. But there was more. Briar Glen's decision to isolate itself had consequences. Nearby settlements depended on it for dry goods and lumber. When those shipments ceased, traders rerouted, and rumors bloomed in their absence. One merchant reported that Briar Glen had been taken over by Confederate raiders. Another said the town was under occupation by Federal scouts. None of it was true, but the absence of communication created space for stories. And stories, as Noah had learned, needed no facts to become fire. This time, the repercussions were faster than before. On September 15th, a Confederate sympathizer group from Mercer County organized an unsanctioned ride toward Briar Glen. They believed they were liberating it from Union control. They never made it past the ridge. Ambushed by what they thought was a Federal patrol, 3 were killed, and the survivors limped back with conflicting accounts, each one worse than the last. Meanwhile, Union scouts heard the same distorted rumors and dispatched a formal reconnaissance team to verify control of the area. When they encountered the Briar Glen Town Patrol, now armed and defensive, it nearly resulted in gunfire. Noah hadn't lifted a single hand. And yet, 2 sides were on the brink of engaging in conflict, based on nothing more than a missing man and a single sentence on torn parchment. The brilliance of it all, at least from Noah's perspective, was in how little it took. One void, one silence. The human mind, desperate to fill the space, did all the work for him. This led him to his most chilling conclusion yet. People didn't fear what was true. They feared what couldn't be disproven. So he began crafting messages with intentional gaps, phrases that seemed urgent but lacked verifiable details, notes that hinted but never confirmed. He'd write them, leave them in predictable places, and watch as towns twisted themselves in knots, trying to decipher meanings that didn't exist. The vaguer the message, the stronger the reaction. Back in Hollow Creek, Elias Griggs finally noticed the storm he couldn't name. He heard of the Cold Hollow collapse, the fires, the rumors about supply lines. He heard of Briar Glen locking itself down, of patrols turning away Federal officers. And something began to gnaw at him. He wasn't sure what it was, but he started watching Noah more closely. Boy no longer read for pleasure. He read war correspondence, trade ledgers, weather reports. He mapped patterns of silence. He tracked rumors as if they were cannon fire. Elias had always known his son was intelligent, but this was something else, something colder. One night he asked him plainly, "Why do you keep records of towns you've never been to?" Noah looked up from his desk. His eyes were distant, analytical. "Because I'm studying how belief moves," he said. "Not what people know, just what they're willing to act on." Elias didn't understand, but the tone unsettled him. Meanwhile, the aftermath in Briar Glen took on a life of its own. The town remained in isolation, and neighboring communities assumed the worst. When no one from Briar Glen arrived at the next trade fair, it was declared compromised. Trade routes shifted permanently. Refugee families, fleeing fear of occupation, avoided the town altogether. and Cold Hollow, still reeling, refused to offer help. Noah had done it again. Accelerated collapse without confrontation. But now, the world around him was starting to feel smaller. He didn't want to burn towns anymore. He wanted to study systems, bigger ones. Not just how fear moved through communities, but through governments, through chains of command, through armies. What if he could make them turn on each other the way neighbors had? What if the next spiral didn't start in a church donation box, but in a command tent? Noah Griggs wasn't just testing fear anymore. He was preparing to weaponize it. By the third week of September, the state had turned into something unrecognizable. A chessboard smeared with spilled ink. Lines of allegiance that once seemed sharp had now bled into confusion. No one trusted proclamations. No one relied on orders without proof, and even proof was beginning to look like illusion. The rail of communication that once held towns together had snapped. And at the heart of this severance sat a boy with ink-stained hands and eyes that never blinked long enough to dream. Noah Griggs had reached a turning point. He had learned to manipulate towns, and he had shifted entire counties. But now, he was focused on something bigger, the command structure itself. He wanted to insert noise into the machine, not to stop it, but to make it sputter, hesitate, out itself. He wasn't interested in being seen. He wanted to be the invisible delay that made orders arrive too late, the static that made generals second guess, the whisper that caused a captain to defy a superior's call, if only by a single hour. He understood that authority was just a fragile trust between what is heard and what is acted upon, and it could be broken. His first attempt came in the form of a fabricated dispatch from a Union scouting unit, describing a failed Confederate raid on a fictitious gunpowder warehouse in Stone Ridge. The warehouse didn't exist, but the message was crafted to sound internal, rushed, and strategically vague, the kind of report that would never be questioned unless failure followed. Noah made sure it reached the desk of a Union quartermaster in Richmond via a traveling blacksmith who believed he was carrying a recovered field report. The reaction was swift, believing Confederate forces were operating dangerously close to their supply routes. Union leadership delayed their next shipment to northern Kentucky. A delay of just 2 days. But it was enough. Confederate agents, real ones this time, moved unimpeded through those corridors during the pause. An entire ammunition convoy was rerouted. An infantry division waited in the hills, undersupplied, as word never came. It wasn't disaster, not yet. But the delay planted frustration. And frustration, Noah had learned, was just fear wearing a hardened mask. He logged the event as Interruption 001, the first in what would become a series of tests not on people, but on systems. With every experiment, Noah grew more precise. His forged reports mimicked handwriting and phrasing styles of actual Union officers. He extracted language patterns from discarded correspondence. He even learned which officers responded emotionally and which delayed action when uncertain. The simulation had now become a study in chain reactions. And he wasn't just sending false information. He was withholding critical truths by intercepting messages. Riders paid off, dispatches delayed, letters misdirected. Noah created bottlenecks in the most invisible way, by guiding where silence should fall. One evening, Elias Griggs overheard Noah murmuring numbers in his sleep, not names or places, but distances, frequencies, delays. He watched his sons hand twitch as if writing in air. Elias no longer understood what his son was becoming. He wasn't just different, he was separate, functioning in a layer of reality that others didn't even know existed. But it wasn't just the Union chain that Noah had his eye on. Confederate strongholds had their own blind spots, especially those too proud to believe information could be corrupted. Noah exploited this arrogance with elegance. He crafted a report that suggested a prominent Confederate colonel in Franklin had been secretly communicating with Federal sympathizers to secure his own family's safety. The report bore just enough credibility, intercepted code fragments, meeting times, and references to trade that Confederate intelligence took it seriously. The colonel was stripped of command, removed without public explanation. His replacement, less experienced, more impulsive, responded to the next Federal movement with reckless aggression. The ambush failed, dozens died, and the fallout shook the confidence of his entire unit. Noah wrote a single word at the bottom of the report he'd copied before it was delivered: predictable. But now something curious happened. The Griggs estate began receiving strange visitors, not customers, not soldiers, but men who looked like they belonged to no side. Observers, question askers. They came under false pretense, interested in trade, they said, or seeking guidance about supply lines. But Elias noticed their boots, too clean, their eyes, too sharp, their questions, too careful. Someone somewhere had begun to notice patterns. Someone had followed the echo of Noah's simulations back to their possible source. They didn't accuse. They didn't demand. They simply watched and left. Elias, terrified of what they might discover, confronted Noah, not with anger, but with desperation. "What are you doing, son?" he asked one night, candlelight trembling between them. Noah looked up slowly, his face pale with the weight of calculation. "I'm trying to understand how long it takes for trust to decay. And when it does?" Noah didn't blink. "Then you can rebuild it differently." Elias didn't sleep that night, but while suspicion slowly reached the edge of Hollow Creek, Noah continued forward. He had begun modeling entire regions now, calculating where delays would cause collapse, predicting what town would respond first to a false raid, which commander would break rank when supply vanished, which governor would send scouts based on incomplete intelligence. He started building outbreak maps, sketches of panic before it happened. He circled towns, drew arrows to neighboring settlements, assigned likelihood percentages for breakdowns in order, cohesion, obedience. It wasn't madness. It was a method, terrifying in its clarity. He even began experimenting with a different medium: sermons. By embedding rumors into the speeches of hired preachers, Noah planted emotional directives into congregations. Not lies, just questions. Who truly stands for you? What does silence from your leaders mean? What if your safety was a lie told to keep you in place? Churches that once called for patience began subtly preparing for war. Entire counties shifted tone within 2 Sundays. Noah called this method sacred delivery, the cleanest form of psychological infection. And all the while, the war grew darker. Not the official one, but the quiet one, the one fought in between the words of orders, in the pauses before decisions, in the hesitation of command. And no one could trace its architect, because Noah had mastered the art of the invisible hand. By the end of September, a new word entered: Noah's journal. Cascade. He defined it as the moment a single act of misinformation didn't just cause confusion, but compelled action from every level of the system, simultaneously. It wasn't theory anymore. Noah Griggs was ready to trigger his first cascade, and the state of Kentucky, held together by fragile alliances and flickering belief in leadership, was the perfect kindling. All it would take was one spark. October crept in quietly, cloaked in smoke from far-off fires and the nervous shuffle of boots on gravel roads. The trees began to turn, their leaves painting the hillsides with shades of decay, as if the land itself was shedding illusions. Across Kentucky, no one could say who was winning the war, or if there was even a war left to win. What they did know was that something invisible had entered their world, a sickness not of body, but of belief. And by the time they realized the fever had already spread. Noah Griggs had written down the formula 2 weeks earlier. He called it a cascade. It wasn't a new idea. Nature had always known it. How one crack in a dam could flood a valley, how one fallen tree could start a mudslide. But Noah had found a way to simulate the same collapse in systems of men. And now, after months of sharpening, he was ready to test it on a scale that could no longer be dismissed as accident. It began in Millhaven, a railroad town with a modest station and an oversized ego. Millhaven was proud of its role in moving grain and iron between counties. Noah chose it precisely for this reason. Pride made towns predictable and dangerously easy to manipulate. He forged a supply manifest detailing a massive weapons shipment scheduled to pass through Millhaven. The manifest appeared to be Confederate in origin, but cleverly disguised. It contained enough inconsistencies to raise alarms, just enough, while also pointing suspicion toward a rival settlement, Halter's Run, a Union-leaning mining village 20 miles east. He made sure the message reached both towns. The same note, delivered differently. In Millhaven, it was slipped into the hand of a trusted depot foreman. In Halter's Run, it was pinned to a fence post beside the mayor's barn. Identical in content, but introduced as if each town was the intended victim of the other. Within 3 days, both towns had mobilized. Millhav. Ian demanded military escort for the incoming shipment. Halter's Run called an emergency town council to discuss possible retaliation. The surrounding settlements, unsure which side was telling the truth, armed themselves too, not to fight, but to survive the fallout. Churches issued calls for vigilance. Blacksmiths ran out of horseshoes and bullet molds. The fear moved faster than any fact. Noah watched the news ripple outward, like a match to dry paper. But that was just the start. He activated a second signal, this time through a chain of couriers who didn't know they were part of a larger scheme. Each carried fragments of information, names, locations, incomplete orders. The brilliance of it wasn't in the lie, it was in the inconsistency. When officials tried to compare stories, they found nothing matched. Maps didn't line up. Names appeared in the wrong places. Some reports contradicted themselves entirely. The confusion forced commanders to delay action, which created power. Vacuums. And in those vacuums, frightened citizens acted on their own. A watchman in Halter's Run shot a stranger without warning. In retaliation, a Millhaven patrol detained 2 traitors on suspicion of espionage. Within a week, both towns declared a state of emergency. Other counties assumed an official conflict had begun. And so, to protect themselves, they picked sides, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of being the last to choose. That was the cascade. Not one battle, but a chain of overreactions, each compounding the next until reality was indistinguishable. From rumor, Noah logged every detail, tracking the sequence like the gears of a pocket watch. There was no center to the storm. Every piece moved because the others moved. It was chaos with a blueprint. Even the federal government noticed. Dispatches arrived in Hollow Creek. Federal scouts questioned local traders. Governors sent riders with questions that had no answers. And still, no one suspected the boy in the study, hunched over his desk, red ink on his fingers, mapping the downfall of logic itself. But inside the Griggs estate, change was coming. Elias. Griggs had grown quiet, not distant, just observant. He watched his son now with something bordering on fear. It wasn't the forging or the secrecy that troubled him most. It was the calm, the ease with which Noah erased towns from trade. Roots or altered the behavior of entire militias with a pencil stroke. Elias had built his business on reliability, on numbers and names, on truth, even if that truth was sold in the form of bullets. But his son had no such anchor. Noah wasn't trying to survive the war. He was trying to rewrite its language. On October 11th, Elias entered Noah's study. Without knocking, he picked up one of the boy's diagrams, a looping series of circles labeled with dates and military insignia. Arrows connected them in ways he didn't understand. "What is this?" he asked. Noah didn't look up. "A feedback loop." "Of what?" "Influence," the boy replied. "Each reaction fuels the next. It doesn't stop unless someone refuses to believe." Elias set the paper down. "And what happens when they refuse?" Noah paused. Then, with unsettling clarity, said, "They become the anomaly, and the system corrects them." It wasn't an answer. It was a sentence, a verdict. That night, Elias sat alone in the dark, watching the hills. For the first time, he wondered whether his son's genius was something to be proud of, or something that needed to be stopped. But by then, it was too late. The cascade had begun drawing in cities. Lexington began rerouting couriers. Louisville's armories locked down supply. Orders for fear of internal sabotage. River ports closed temporarily, citing unconfirmed threats. Noah hadn't even touched these places. The fear spread itself now, passed from one official to another like a sickness. He had achieved self-replication. The system was now infecting itself. And while leaders scrambled to decode the panic, while militia regrouped and families fled, Noah began working on the next evolution. He no longer wanted to influence behavior. He wanted to predict it in real time. For that, he needed patterns, faster ones, mathematical ones. He needed a way to sort through the chaos, not just observe it. And so, Noah returned to the books he'd read in childhood. Algorithms, sequences, probability chains. But now he looked at them not as puzzles, but as prophecy. What if he could anticipate the moment before someone broke rank? What if he could see which general would fall for a lie before the lie was written? It wouldn't be magic. It would be code, human behavior as a formula, emotions as data. Noah Griggs had already proven that belief could be weaponized. Now he intended to mechanize it, and the cascade was only the test. October deepened like a bruise. In the valleys, fog lingered long past sunrise. On the roads, fewer wagons passed. The silence between towns was no longer just quiet. It felt watched. In every church and tavern, conversations leaned closer. Voices dropped lower, and eyes glanced over shoulders. No town trusted its neighbor. No courier trusted his orders. The land itself had entered a paralysis of anticipation, waiting for something no one could name. Yet everyone feared was already in motion. In Hollow Creek, Noah Griggs stopped writing by hand. His journal, once overflowing with notes and looping arrows, now sat unopened beside his desk. The boy had entered a different stage of thought, one where words felt too slow, and ideas arrived faster than ink could follow. He wasn't just planning anymore. He was processing. Noah had begun designing systems within systems, not maps of chaos, but blueprints for prediction. He believed that if he could assign probability to human behavior, then nothing would ever be uncertain again. Emotion, reaction, panic. These weren't abstract concepts to him. They were measurable, assignable, patterns waiting to be discovered. The foundation of his method came from a childhood obsession. Sequences. Fibonacci, Pascal's triangle, the rule of thirds, all once studied by candlelight for their beauty. Now, he looked at them as if they were mirrors to human behavior. How often did towns repeat the same response to fear? How long did it take? A message to spread, mutate, and ignite violence? How many repetitions until a pattern emerged? He called it the behavioral algorithm, and he wasn't building it for war. He was building it for clarity. He wanted to know how many lies it would take to break a man. How many days of silence before a soldier disobeyed? How many conflicting reports until a commander froze? And once those numbers were known, he could bend any outcome to his will without lifting a finger. Noah began conducting dry simulations, entirely in his head. He would close his eyes, picture a map, insert a false event, and calculate the chain reactions down to the hour. When he reopened his eyes, he would check the reports brought in by couriers. And nearly every time, the results aligned. He began trusting the algorithm more than reality. It was in this state of accelerated thinking that Noah made his most terrifying discovery yet. The algorithm worked better when emotion was removed. Fewer variables tied to conscience, empathy, or regret, the more precisely the outcomes aligned with prediction. The moment he stopped imagining individuals as people, and instead as behavioral nodes, the algorithm began to self-correct with stunning accuracy. This revelation did not disturb him. It comforted him. It meant unpredictability wasn't human nature. It was just unmeasured complexity. And complexity could always be simplified with enough observation, enough iterations, and the willingness to detach. Elias Griggs, however, noticed the change. Noah no longer spoke at dinner. He didn't even blink when Elias mentioned the growing instability across the region. Armories locking down. Trade dead. Reports of men shooting at shadows. Elias tried to bring up their business, contracts, shipments, the future. But Noah only stared ahead, as if measuring a variable just out of sight. One evening, Elias found a parchment left on the boy's desk. It was filled with symbols, some numerical, others borrowed from different alphabets entirely. The heading: Read simply, Trust Decay Curves, by region. He read just enough to feel sick. What chilled Elias most wasn't the content. It was the tone. Cold, clean, surgical. He wanted to confront Noah, but what would he say? What was there to argue with? The boy wasn't hiding secrets anymore. He had become the secret. And outside, the world was reflecting his work. In late October, 3 counties simultaneously blocked federal access roads, each claiming they had received contradictory orders from regional commanders. They hadn't. Noah had merely created enough confusion in the dispatch chains that no one trusted what was real. That same week, a shipment of munitions was destroyed by its own escort unit, believing they were intercepting enemy supplies. Reports conflicted so widely that no one could determine the truth. And that was the point. It wasn't about what happened anymore. It was about who could prove what hadn't. Noah logged this as algorithm validation, Tier 3. The more he tested, the more predictable people became. He even began running projections for people he'd never met. Generals, governors, priests, using their public statements, correspondence styles, and reaction times, he assigned them percentages, likelihoods of certain behaviors under pressure. And he wasn't wrong when a respected Union commander resigned, abruptly following a fabricated scandal involving troop misplacement. Noah had predicted the withdrawal 3 days in advance, down to the hour. The boy wasn't guessing. He was calculating collapse. But now, Noah began asking a question that had no immediate answer. If systems could be predicted, could he? He began running simulations on himself, not emotionally, but behaviorally. What stimuli changed his output? What patterns did he follow? He noted when he worked best. When he hesitated, what distracted him? What compelled action? It became a recursive loop, the machine watching itself. But the more he refined the algorithm, the more distant he grew. Noah stopped sleeping at night. Not from fear or restlessness, but because his mind never stopped moving. He once stayed awake for 3 days, recording dozens of simulations, tracking each one with the precision of a scientist watching chemical reactions. Elias, exhausted, considered sending for help. Not from the army, from a doctor, a clergyman, anyone. But part of him was terrified of what would happen if Noah sensed intervention. The boy was no longer just a gifted child. He was a system of his own now, and systems, when threatened, defended themselves. That fear came. True one evening when Elias tried to remove a stack of Noah's papers, just to keep them safe. The boy appeared in the doorway, silent, his face unreadable. "Don't touch the data," he said flatly. Elias froze. "I wasn't destroying anything, Noah." "I know, but movement introduces uncertainty. The files are exactly where they need to be." There was no anger in his voice, just calculation. A mind running too far ahead to care about feeling. And that night, for the first time, Elias locked his bedroom door. Outside, the world had begun to fracture into factions. Militias not authorized by any official banner sprang up, defending towns from imagined threats. Roads became battlegrounds. Towns barricaded themselves over rumors traced back to no source. Governors issued contradictory decrees. And still, no one suspected the real cause. Noah Griggs, age 13, sat in a quiet room in Hollow Creek, mapping fear like others mapped stars. His algorithm wasn't just working. It was learning. Somewhere in the hollow silence between pages, between towns, between one heartbeat and the next, it had begun to think for itself. By the first frost of November, Kentucky had become a whispering skeleton of its former self. The wind moved through towns like a messenger that no longer bothered with names. People no longer waited for official news. They made decisions based on rumors, patterns, and their own worst fears, each of which now felt indistinguishable from truth. Flags were flown less for loyalty and more for self-preservation. And in the corners of the map, where power was once centralized, governors sat paralyzed by indecision, unable to act without second-guessing who had whispered to them last. The system had fractured, but it wasn't an explosion. It was a quiet unraveling, precise, controlled, timed. And in the attic of the Griggs estate, Noah sat before his ledger, watching it all. Not celebrating, not even thinking of himself as the cause anymore. He saw it as a natural process, an inevitability that had simply needed a push. The cascade had evolved beyond manipulation. It was self-reinforcing. The towns wrote their own fears. The militias drew their own enemies. The governments issued denials of actions they had never taken, simply because someone else accused them of doing it first. Noah's algorithm had entered what he now called emergent phase, a system no longer requiring instruction, but one which generated its own data loops, which fed its own expansion. He recorded it all, not like a proud creator, but like a detached observer studying a wildfire. Elias Griggs, however, had reached a breaking point. For weeks, he'd watched the boy operate without emotion, recording the unraveling of counties as if he were cataloging weather. Every attempt Elias made to pull him back, to appeal to the human side he once knew, had failed. And now, after seeing the latest report of 3 neighboring towns forcibly evacuating due to non-existent threats, he couldn't remain silent. That night, Elias entered the attic. He didn't ask permission. He didn't knock. He found Noah sitting before a wall of data sheets, each pinned with such meticulous care that it looked less like a study and more like a ritual. In front of him sat the central ledger, the one Noah referred to simply as the sequence. "I'm ending this," Elias said. Noah turned slowly. His expression was not angry. It was analytical. "You can't," he replied. "I can burn it. I can tear every page off this wall. That won't stop it. The behavior has already been modeled. The reaction is self-fulfilling now. Even if you burn every note, It will still play out. Elias stared at the boy, his boy, and for the first time, he realized Noah wasn't lying. Not as a defense, but as a truth. The system no longer needed him. It was functioning like an organism now, and it was expanding. Noah. Elias's voice cracked. You're talking about people, not patterns. These are families. These are variables, Noah said, finishing the sentence not with cruelty, but with certainty. We are all variables, Father. The only difference is I've seen the equation. Elias stepped back. I should have stopped you months ago. Noah returned his attention to the pages in front of him. You couldn't have. You still believed in the integrity of the system. That's what made you vulnerable. Outside, a rider passed the road in the distance, moving fast, too fast to be casual. Noah had already predicted the message he carried, the collapse of Millhaven's council and the outbreak of violence along the Halters Run border. The algorithm had been off by less than 4 hours. Elias didn't speak. He descended the stairs in silence, unsure of whether to call a doctor, a priest, or the army. But it wouldn't have mattered. The next morning, reports poured in from across the state. Entire routes had been abandoned, civil offices burned, food convoys diverted by unauthorized roadblocks. No central authority could verify what was happening, and that alone ensured the spread would continue. That evening, Noah returned his study and opened a fresh page. He began writing not in words, but in sequences, lines of numbers, symbols, predicted movements. The structure no longer needed language. The algorithm had entered a new stage, one he now referred to as echoform. It meant the system could anticipate emotional contagion. It didn't need a source event anymore. It only needed the memory of one. He had, in effect, removed the burden of causality. Noah wrote, Echoform allows fear to sustain itself through structure rather than stimulus. In simple terms, people were now afraid not because something had happened, but because something might, and the network of distrust made that possibility feel like certainty. It was belief. Looped. That same night, far away, a military tribunal attempted to consolidate power in one of the last stable counties. They issued decrees, canceled elections, and imposed curfews. It was meant to restore order. Instead, it triggered 3 preemptive coups in surrounding territories. Noah watched it unfold on the maps he kept updated by the hour. Each move made by authority now triggered rebellion, not because people were rebellious, but because they had learned to expect betrayal. The spiral tightened, and with every rotation, Noah's predictions became cleaner, sharper. He wasn't manipulating reality anymore. He was describing it. For the first time, Noah allowed himself a moment of reflection. What had started as a fascination with control had evolved into something much more elemental. He no longer saw himself as a boy playing God. That was too simple, too childish. He was a lens, a mirror, an interpreter of inevitability. The world, he believed, had always been this fragile. He had merely revealed it. That evening, for the first time in weeks, he left the house. He walked to the edge of the hill overlooking Hollow Creek. Fires glowed faintly on the far side of the valley. Riders moved in the dark like smudged ink. He listened to the stillness, and then he spoke aloud to no one. The equation is almost complete. Behind him, the world gasped through chaos. Ahead of him, something else waited. Not war, not peace, but prediction. He no longer wanted to cause events. He wanted to know them before they were born. And that knowing, that absolute foresight, would be the final stage. Noah Griggs had become the algorithm, but one final chapter remained. By the second week of November, the collapse was no longer theoretical. Counties that once operated under the flag of the Union or the Confederacy now resembled autonomous islands. each improvising their own justice, their own truths. Telegraph. Lines buzzed with disjointed signals, and riders carried messages that contradicted themselves by the time they crossed the next town line. No one trusted written orders anymore. No one waited for confirmation. Every action was preemptive. Every silence was seen as a trap. Reality had fractured, and in its place stood only reaction. The world was now a mirror hall of Noah Griggs's own design, and yet, for all his control, Noah was uneasy. He felt it not as panic or fear, but as an unfamiliar glitch in the rhythm. His equations, once razor-sharp, had begun to fluctuate. Predictions he once calculated to the hour were now off by entire days. Not wrong, but delayed. Ripple effects appeared slower than expected. Unrest didn't always spread where it should. Some towns resisted the narrative, and in the center of it all, a silence had formed. It was Hollow Creek, the town that should have, by now, succumbed to the very chaos Noah had perfected. Had not. Its people were quiet. They spoke less, feared more, and yet they held together. The school still opened its doors. The church bell still rang. Farmers still traded, if cautiously. Hollow Creek had become the algorithm's only true anomaly, a place where fear hadn't metastasized. And this, more than anything, disturbed Noah. It suggested something he had not accounted for. A human constant. He began documenting the anomaly. He noted how Hollow Creek's residents shared food with one another, even when suspicion loomed. How the mayor, an aging woman named Ruth Alcott, refused to close the local infirmary, even after 2 false reports of militia sabotage. She had no reason to trust anyone, yet she did. Noah labeled it the Alcott constant. He defined it as a localized immunity to systemic fear, a counterweight to ecoform, and it was unacceptable. For if one variable could defy the model, then the model itself was flawed. So he intervened. He inserted falsified messages into Hollow Creek's community post, anonymous letters accusing the mayor of secretly working with foreign agents. He planted notes implying that a nearby town had been infiltrated by disease and that Hollow Creek would be next. He sent children home with whispered rumors about food being poisoned. The town shook, but it did not break. Instead of fracturing, it closed in on itself. Not in paranoia, but in protection. Neighbors walked each other home. Elders began sleeping near the church, guarding it through the night. And the mayor, despite every reason to run, stood before the town square and said, "If we fall to rumor, we are no longer worth saving." That night, for the first time in his life, Noah's formula failed, and he knew it. He stared at the walls of his attic, now covered in maps, charts, and behavioral loops. The data pointed to collapse, but the reality stood firm. The algorithm, for all its brilliance, had not accounted for something so irrational and simple. Choice, not the kind based on fear, or self-interest, or probability, but choice made without benefit, choice made in defiance of the logical path. It was unpredictable, and therefore, to the algorithm, it was dangerous. Noah felt something unfamiliar move through him. Not anger, not confusion, but disruption. A crack in the system, a question that the numbers could not answer. And in that moment, Noah realized the truth he had never dared to articulate. He had not built the algorithm to control the world. He had built it to escape it, to impose order on the chaos he couldn't understand as a child, to make sense of betrayal, of abandonment, of death, all reduced to sequences he could command. But Hollow Creek reminded him of something he had buried, that not everything broken needs replacing. Some things endure not because they're strong, but because they refuse to be anything else. That night, Elias Griggs entered his son's attic again, not as an intruder, but as a father. He found Noah sitting silently in the dark, pages scattered. around him like fallen leaves. For once, the boy wasn't working. He was listening to the wind outside, to the church bell echoing across the hills, to the sound of a town still breathing. Elias didn't speak. He sat beside him, and together, in silence, they watched the candle flicker. In the days that followed, Noah did something no one expected. He erased it. Line by line, chart by chart, he tore down the algorithm. Not because it had failed, but because it had proven something he couldn't accept. That the one variable he feared most, hope, had not been defeated. He knew the system would still spin without him. That fear would continue to move through regions like wind through trees. But he also knew that somewhere, someone would resist. Not because it made sense, but because it mattered. Noah walked away from his attic that week. He didn't stop being who he was, but he stopped needing the world to bend beneath his equations. He began to observe instead of manipulate. He started asking questions without rushing toward answers. And in doing so, he touched something beyond calculation. Not divinity, not destiny, but humility. The boy once known as the algorithm, child faded into legend, a name whispered in academic circles and old war memoirs. Some said he'd built machines decades ahead of their time. Others believed he had been a prophet of collapse. But no one ever really found proof. The Griggs estate became a quiet relic, and Hollow Creek, against all odds, endured. Because in the end, the algorithm wasn't broken by war or exposure or rebellion. It was broken by a simple, stubborn refusal to believe that fear should be the final word. And that truth, that final variable, was the one thing not even science could explain.